Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. I want to acknowledge that Chief Scoggins is here and will discuss the Seattle Fire Department's response to this morning's fire. Seattle Police Department has also investigated a shooting in the University District last night. They are investigating at this point and don't have anything past what was been announced publicly. We are the 18th largest city in the country with big city safety challenges that require a 24/7 response to every part of our city. As many have seen, we are seeing an unprecedented uptick in gun violence in cities across America. Chief Best and I continue to center work with community-based organizations to prevent violence, and also know that the Seattle Police Department must respond to and investigate shootings. We are working very hard to reduce the number of shootings here in Seattle and hope that we do not see the same kind of uptick that cities throughout this country are seeing. Chief Best and I have been meeting with a range of community members and organizations in recent weeks, and our teams have been working on a thorough, I repeat, a thorough review of the Seattle Police Department's budget and organization. This kind of assessment takes time and will be ongoing. We both recognize that we have a historical opportunity and obligation to reimagine how policing can be done in Seattle. We believe deeply in broad community investments, which can build greater community health and less need to call 911 for help. And when someone does call 911, we want them to get the help they need. Sometimes they will need a police officer immediately. Sometimes they will need other help, like a firefighter, a medic, or family support counselor. Building a new kind of 24/7 response network will take time and broad community engagement. It will take resources and trained personnel. But as we do that, we can also reimagine how the Seattle Police Department itself will function. Today, the Chief and I are announcing some early actions to transform the Seattle Police Department and make some significant reorganizations in the department. Chief Best and I both come from unique backgrounds as we approach rethinking and reimagining policing and community safety in Seattle. Chief Best has been part of this department for over 30 years, and every step of the way, she has been working to improve the department. She is a nationally recognized leader who loves this city and the men and women who serve it. She has always brought her view that the Seattle Police Department serves the public in every job she's had, and that's nowhere more evident as her being chief. Decades ago, I served as the first citizen observer to the Seattle Police Firearms Review Board that reviewed all police shootings. I later worked on oversight committees that led to the creation of the Office of Police Accountability, and another that led to the former auditor position being full-time and paid. As U.S. Attorney, I was able to rely on the work of the Seattle Police Department, but also led the civil rights investigation that led to the consent decree, which I signed. I too love this city, and I am enormously grateful for all of the city workers who serve this city, including the men and women of the Seattle Police Department, who have worked under extremely difficult circumstances over the last several months. As Chief Scoggins and Chief Best will tell you, their teams were the front line of responding to a global health pandemic. We are in the midst of an economic crisis and a civil rights movement. 3 weeks ago, Chief Best and I both laid out our vision for policing and community safety in Seattle. The challenges and systemic problems that community has rightfully asked us to solve are difficult and deeply entrenched in American society and government. No one mayor, no one chief, and no one city will solve them on their own. But we must act. We must begin the change now. The chief and I are committed to doing so. We believe we can lead the nation as we have done before. But I must be clear, we will not support any effort to abolish the police department or cuts that will compromise the chief and SPD's ability to serve the people of Seattle. We know that not every 911 call requires an officer to arrive with a gun. In so many instances, people might be better served by a mental health professional, a firefighter, a dispute resolution specialist, or a social worker. Sometimes it takes both. Over the last decade, we've asked police to respond to so many of society and government's failures, including substance abuse, behavioral health crisis, and homelessness. But it's clear that law enforcement is not always the appropriate avenue to deal with these issues. We need to invest in community-based solutions that address the underlying root issues leading to these challenges. Community has made clear they want us to transform the Seattle Police Department and to reinvest in programs that provide this kind of community safety. As Chief Best and I continue going into a deeper analysis of the Seattle Police Department's budget, and most important, the personnel and departments that we need, we have quickly identified some common sense transfers, reorganizations, and reductions that we can make for next year's budget. Today, the Chief and I are announcing an initial $76 million in reductions to the 2021 budget. These initial actions will keep 911 service accessible and available 24/7 in every part of the city, with appropriate response times in every neighborhood. We have that obligation as we work through this process of reimagining and restructuring community safety in Seattle. $56 million will be transferred out of the department's 2021 budget by moving the following functions to civilian non-enforcement oversight. The 911 call center will be moved out of the Seattle Police Department. The Parking Enforcement Division will be moved out of the Seattle Police Department and into the Seattle Department of Transportation. The Office of Emergency Management and Office of Police Accountability also will be moved out of the Police Department. In addition, we've identified an initial $20 million in cuts by not expanding the force in 2021 and making reductions to overtime. Our assessment of what needs to be done has to be based on facts and data so that we can continue to serve the people of Seattle. Our actions are an important start, but the work we're doing for assessments will continue and actually require community engagement and a deep assessment of SPDs and its jobs. The Chief and I had already recognized the needs for these ties to community and for alternative responses. It's why we relaunched the community service officers, who are civilians working on youth safety and non-emergency calls. It's why we added mental health workers at every SPD precinct. It's why we created alternative programs for individuals calling 911, like Health One, which Chief Scoggins helped design. It's why a social worker and a firefighter respond to calls that previously police responded to. It's why we increased nurses at our homeless shelters, particularly those that were the highest for 911 calls. We know those kind of public health interventions work, but they have to be planned, they have to be resourced, and they have to be in place. In one of her first actions as chief, Chief Best launched the first ever in the country, the Collaborative Policing Bureau. While every officer is committed to community engagement, this bureau brought together community policing teams and CSOs in a new way under Assistant Chief Diaz. We know we must act urgently, but we cannot simply cut functions from SPD or quit responding to 911 calls. If we want to be able to send the right help, which sometimes will not be a police officer, we have to build that capability with the right people, the right resources, and the right training, 24/7 in every part of our city. Right now, SPD is doing two major deep dives into their data and their organization. 911 calls and reviewing specialty units. We cannot cut officers overnight when there's no plan. We will be assessing how many officers we actually need to respond 24/7 in every part of our city. Doing the job right has to be the basis for budgeting decisions. Chief Best and I are committed to this complex work. It's why we have SPD and the Budget Office currently evaluating what calls are best handled by someone other than a sworn officer. Looking at SPD functions to determine if any can be civilianized, transferred, reduced, or eliminated. Looking at nearly 800,000 911 calls from community to determine should there be new emergency response protocols. Looking at data on arrests and bookings to determine if citations would be more appropriate. The response to other agencies, including Metro and the Seattle Public Schools. Current overtime practices, including staffing at special events and sporting events. And potential expansion of programs like Health One and community service officers, which provide civilian, need-based responses to emergencies. All of these potential areas for transformation are deeply complex, and we must approach each problem with a level of intelligence and planning to ensure we actually make lasting change. Most importantly, I know that Chief Best and I don't have all the answers yet on all the transformative changes that we want to make. We need to continue listening to communities. We need to continue looking at the data and the facts and the best models from around the country and around the world. There's going to be a lot of good ideas. We need to harness those good ideas while protecting community safety. We want to have meaningful discussions on how we can make these changes. Not only the initial changes that we propose today, but the changes we want to make in the 2021 budget and in the future in Seattle. I've talked to many about the approach that I think is best and the assessments we're doing for the Seattle Police Department. Well, I had hoped that City Council would work with Chief Best and I on this historic chance for transformative change. And while I've talked to many in the City Council, I think this city needs to see us working together. We need to show that we can rise to this occasion and make meaningful and thoughtful change. Unfortunately, at this time, the Council is approaching an alternative approach. To date, the City Council has done almost no analysis on SPD's budget, 911 calls, or staffing models needed for a 24/7 response to every part of the city. They haven't even talked to the Chief of Police to get her views and her experience over 30 years serving the people of Seattle. Instead, they have made the arbitrary decision to defund the Seattle Police Department by 50% this year in 2020 and 50% next year. 7 out of 9 council members committed to cutting the Seattle Police Department's budget by 50% without talking to the Chief of Police. 7 out of 9 council members committed to cutting SPD's budget by 50% without a plan on how they would do so, what they would cut, or an assessment of what those cuts would have on response times, officer diversity, training, and the affordability of existing precincts, let alone the labor implications or whether certain cuts could take us out of compliance with the federal consent decree. This is simply not responsible. You can't govern by Twitter or bumper sticker. Community safety is too important not to have thoughtful approach. I think Seattle expects more of its government. It expects us to function better than Washington, D.C., and it expects us to work together to solve these incredibly important and historical challenges. I want to thank Chief Best for her partnership and her commitment to this city and to this effort. She really is a national leader in community-based and need-based policing. We are very lucky to have her in Seattle. Truly transforming policing can happen and will happen under her leadership. It'll also take the leadership of Chief Scoggins because the fire department has been innovative in this space. We saw the launch of Health One, so now a trained medic and social worker respond to calls that previously a police officer respond to. Chief Best and I, Chief Scoggins, and all of the city remain committed to rethinking and reimagining what community safety looks like, how we build that first, deepest layer of community safety by making community investments in communities so they have access to health care and housing, education, and economic opportunity. The right and responsible way to go about this transformation is first to develop, in partnership with community, a needs-based analysis and approach so that when individuals call 911, they get the help they need. But to do that, we have to build up that other capability. Budget follows values and form. You don't cut first and then think about what you will do. Once you have developed a new model in policing and greater community investments and a new model for health-based solutions, then you build that budget. But a preliminary, blunt cut of 50% without any alternative plan or any ability to answer those other calls has the potential to decimate the department's ability to respond to emergencies and leave parts of Seattle with no alternative. With that, I will turn it over to Chief Best to discuss the consequences of the council's cut to the department, and then Chief Scoggins will address the fire from last night. But let me just say in closing, I meet with council members regularly. I've talked to almost every council member about these topics. We want to work together collaboratively to do this in the right way. Please join us in doing that. Blunt cuts won't work. A 50% cut with no plan and no assessment on how that will impact every business and resident in Seattle is irresponsible. I'd now like to turn it over to Chief Best, who will be followed by Chief Scoggins.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Mayor Durkan. Thank you for your continued support of the men and women of the Seattle Police Department, and thank you for your commitment to a comprehensive re-envisioning of what community safety could look like here in Seattle. I am so grateful for all of the community members who have offered their support in the past few days. Working with you and others is how we are going to develop our future model of policing and community safety. You help reform the department, where we have done so much of what is being called for nationally. We're already there in Seattle. And now you will help us transform our department. I want to thank our officers who are continuing to answer calls, run into the face of danger, offer aid, all while hearing a political conversation that half of them aren't needed. Let me make it clear to all of those officers, you all are needed. It is because of you we completed the hard work of the consent decree. You're one of the best trained departments in the country. We know you are needed because just 5 short months ago, we celebrated, along with some of the council members, the launch of a new campaign to recruit officers who are from this community and who represent the communities that we serve. I have made many close connections in the city in my almost 30 years in uniform. We have not always agreed on everything. In fact, we have disagreed on many things. But you all know that I share the same commitment you do to make this the best city for every single person who is here. It is reckless to advocate for this type of cuts that have been proposed by the City Council, especially with no time or plan to have a realistic alternative response in place. Let me be clear, I will not choose to fire officers. But if they leave me in this circumstance, we have no other choice. Our budget is almost entirely personnel, and almost everything that isn't personnel costs has been eliminated to help address the COVID-19 budget gap. I will not sacrifice officers of color for political points. As with most labor unions in this country, there are predetermined rules about how terminations occur. Our hiring unit has done tremendous work in recent years. So many officers of color will be out of a job as a result of this last in, first out process. And regardless of what some council members have suggested, there is no precedent for a large-scale, out-of-order termination process with officers. That sounds like an easy political fix, but in reality, it is far more complicated. These officers have families. They are members of the community. So yes, in part, this is about them too. But it is also about overall public safety. Officers spend most of their time responding to in-progress emergencies, criminal incidents, and supporting other departments and events. There is simply no way safety will not be compromised if half of these officers are fired. We can have transformative changes, but we have to do it together. There has to be a plan, and it cannot be achieved by firing half of the city's police officers overnight or in a matter of months. So we need to come together and truly re-envision community safety. I'll turn it over to Chief Scoggins. I want to thank him as well for being a supporter of public safety and of the police department, because together we realize how important it is to have a unified effort to make sure that public safety is maintained in the city of Seattle. Chief Scoggins.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Chief Best. Thank you, Mayor Durkan. I just want to give a brief update on the fire this morning. At 04:52 a.m. this morning at 2473 Aurora Avenue North, it's a location called the Hillside Motel, our units responded to a fire. And we do this all the time. This one was a little bit different. This is a motel, 11 units. If you've been down Aurora and directly across from Canlis to the south a bit are two motels. One is a single-story motel and one is a multi-level motel. It was the multi-level motel that was at where the fire was on the third floor. Our first ladder truck and our first engine company, when they arrived on scene, they encountered multiple people. People jumping out of windows on the second and the third floor, people that were burned. Our units went into immediate action and started placing ladders all around the structure to help with rescue, and our engine companies went direct on the fire to attack the fire to put the fire out. As more units arrived on scene, we treated a number of patients. We actually treated and evaluated 7 patients on the scene, and 6 of them were transported to Harborview. 3 of those 6 are in critical condition, and the other 3 are in stable condition. Very challenging fire this morning. Our fire investigators, SPD's Arson Bomb Squad, and ATF are on the scene right now, following up on the investigation. So that's a brief update on the fire this morning. Thank you.
It might be appropriate if there's anyone that has questions for Chief Scoggins first on the fire. We can take those.
Thank you, Mayor. If anyone has a question for Chief Scoggins on the fire, if you could please use the hand raise function, and I will make sure to read you in.
And it won't count as one of their questions.
You can have a second question if you couldn't hear that from the mayor. While I'm waiting for hand raise, we'll go ahead and get started with the question.
Sounds good.
We have first question from Omari Salisbury, Converge Media, followed by Chris Daniels, King 5. Omari, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, Mayor Durkan, Chief Best. My question is that we've heard a lot from your office, from both offices, to say a lot about your interaction with community leaders, members of the community, but we've yet to get any information as to who exactly is the office of the mayor meeting with, who exactly is the police chief meeting with, especially me as a media organization that's based in the Black community. I'm very anxious to know who exactly are you guys talking to when you're getting information for these very important decisions that are being made.
Thank you, Omar. I think that's actually a great question, and actually there's been a lot of information about that because there's such a saturation, it's hard to follow. But for example, in the room today, just by volunteering as one of the associate pastors at Mount Zion, the chief and I both met with, as you know, the day you were at the church, before the meeting we had with some of the folks from the area on Capitol Hill, we also met with Black ministers. I've met with any range of organizations and people, some who've asked for meetings, some who I've ended up meeting with. I had met with protesters who showed up at the door. We can try to compile a list, but I will say that I don't believe that any mayor and any chief should try to meet just with people they agree with, nor with people that they deem legitimate. And so I have everyone from representatives from Not This Time to Africatown to other protesters to black community to established black-led organizations. So we are trying to make it very broad. Many of those people, I know this may shock you, don't want press in the room when they're talking because they want to have a candid conversation with their chief and their mayor because it is a difficult time for everyone. So we've done both public meetings and meetings that are more private, and we'll continue to do so.
Thank you, Mayor. Our next question will come from Chris Daniels, King 5, followed by Justin Carter, CHSCM. Chris Daniels, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. I am just curious for the chief and the mayor. The city of Minneapolis has laid out a timeline for re-envisioning their police department, changing their police department, changing the funding of their police department. Would you be open to working with the council on a timeline where people would see change?
So, Chris, it's a great question, and the short answer is yes, and we've done that. We've laid out what we think the process and timeline is, and council decided in the space of hours to, by tweet, decide they were going to cut the police department by 50%, without looking what those cuts would have on the ability to have service for the residents and business of Seattle. People also often point to Camden in a way that is, frankly, misunderstood and misleading. The Camden police force was disbanded not because community wanted it to be disbanded, but because of a fight the Republican governor was having at that time so that they could hire police officers cheaper. It ended up in Camden with a police department that had higher uses of forces and was not responding to community, and then community demanded, surprisingly, not surprisingly, that they do the things that we've been doing in the last 10 years in Seattle: de-escalation training, outreach, mental health interventions. So all of those steps we are willing to take, but if you look what Minneapolis is trying to do, literally, many of the things they're laying out, we've already done in the last 10 years. People talk about wanting to have de-escalation training. Seattle Police Department's de-escalation training is literally the model for the nation. They talk about having better mental health interventions. We had 17,000 crisis calls last year the Seattle Police Department responded to. Now, we'd like for police officers not to be the first line of defense in those calls. But if you want those 17,000 calls answered, not by a police officer, you have to have hundreds of trained responders available 24/7. That's the kind of resources and thinking that it takes. And so, of course, I'm willing to work with council. I've been talking to council about this. We laid out what we thought our timeline was. 7 out of 9 of the members decided over a period of hours that they were just going to cut 50%. I want to add one last thing to that. It is very unclear to me what they mean by cutting 50% from the 2020 budget, because they've said it two ways in different forums. Some of them said they wanted 50% cut from the 2020 whole budget. If that's what they want to do, we are halfway through the year. That means zeroing out the police budget and no more police services this year. Now, some of them are saying, oh, we didn't mean that. What we meant was 50% of what's left. It's not what they said, but if that's what they mean, they should tell the public. And they should say what their plan is to replace those services for the residents and businesses in Seattle. Do the residents and businesses of Seattle want to close a precinct? Do they want to have response time so that if you need a cop, they show up maybe 15 or 20 minutes after you call? All of those things can happen if you just take blunt cuts. So the chief and I are 100% committed and showed today that we will reimagine and transform this department. But we will not sacrifice community safety to do that.
Thank you, Mayor. Our next question will be from Justin Carter, Capitol Hill, Seattle, followed by Hannah Scott, Cairo Radio. Justin, the floor is yours.
thanks. Mayor, I want to follow up on that last answer. I'm curious, given what you just said, if there is alternatives that you are open to and discussing around the 2020 budget. I understand you're focused now looking at 2021, but what about now? What about something more immediate, like the calls that so many thousands of people went to speak to call for and ask for?
So that's a great question. If you look at the reductions we did make, that we have already shown that we did that. And I just want to make clear is, again, the people are in the street for a righteous cause. I believe in it. The chief believes in it. But transformative change can't happen with a wave of a wand. You can't just cut a department and not have the other services that you need to respond to community needs. And again, we've been trying to get this in place, not as urgently as I know we must do, but again, it's why we put nurses in the homeless shelters that had the highest number of calls. We found that if you had that public health person there, the number of times you had to call police dropped dramatically. It's why we created Health One for a social worker and medic to come to someone with behavioral health issues instead of a police officer. These programs take time, though. Health One, we had to design it, we had to hire, we had to recruit, we had to train. We're working with agencies. Last year, my budget increased our investments in other organizations, community-based organizations like Choose 180 and Community Passageways that can go upstream and try to deter criminal conduct from happening and to try to provide opportunity. We're providing 2 years free college and jobs for youth. We know that we have to invest greatly in community, and I am committed to do that on a broad scale. I've already said we will find $100 million in additional sums next year to make the kind of investments that I hear communities say they want. They want investment in their children, in their families. They want investments so that their kids have the best schools and the best economic opportunities, that they have access to health care and child care. Those kinds of investments will reduce the number of times that people have to call 911. So we want to reduce the number of times people call 911, and then when they do call, we can send them the help that they need.
Thank you, Mayor. Our next question will come from Hannah Scott, Cairo Radio, followed by Steve Kiggins, Q13. Hannah, the floor is yours.
No. Hi, Mayor. I'm wondering if with 7 of 9 of the council members getting support for 50% cuts, whatever that might look like for them for the rest of this year and next year, should they pass something like that with 7 of 9 votes? Is there anything at all you can do about it? And Chief, how might that level of cuts impact the ability to respond to mass casualty events?
I'm going to let the chief answer the second part first, and then I'll answer the other part.
Hi, good morning, Hannah. As you know, response times is one of the most critical things for calls for service that we have. And if we have half the amount of people to respond to calls for service, we know that statistically that's going to mean much higher response times. And if there's a mass casualty event, heaven forbid, there's going to be a very limited police response. We simply won't have the personnel to get there. As you know, when we had the mass casualty event on 3rd and Pine earlier this year, officers were there in less than a minute. In seconds. They were there quickly with the fire department, offering first aid, helping people with the tourniquets, identifying suspects, and working diligently to resolve that as quickly as possible. That simply won't happen if we don't have the number of officers that we need to respond.
And for the first part, I'm hoping that after some thought and deliberation, that a majority of the council will actually say, we want to do this the right way. We know that there's changes that can be made immediately, and there's other changes that will take time. For example, moving the 911 center can't be done in 2020, but we're committed to doing that. So some of these changes will take some time. We want to show the things that we think can happen now. I have been working and talking with council since I became mayor on every single topic. And I'll continue to do that because I think that's what the city expects of us. I think they want our government to function better than Washington, D.C. They want us working together to solve these unbelievable challenges. We are in the midst of the most transformative time our city and our country has ever seen. We're in the middle of a global health pandemic, which is getting worse by the day in Seattle, in King County, and across our country. We are in the midst of the worst economic downturn and job loss and the impacts that has had on so many workers and families. And we're in the midst of a civil rights uprising and movement. Those three things together require us, oblige us, to find common solutions and common ground, to work urgently, yes, but to actually get generational change, you have to be thoughtful.
Thank you, Mayor. Our next question will come from Steve Kiggins, Q13, followed by David Cronin, Prospect. Steve, the floor is yours.
Ms. Mayor and Chief Best, Ms. Mayor, I wanted to ask you a follow-up about, you mentioned that you were hoping that the council would have additional deliberation about the plans, and you have hoped that they might change that plan. However, if that's not the reality, what is it that your office and Chief Beth's office have taken in the background in these past few days to come up with a budget that meets that demand along with council? What does that look like for next year? If you can answer that question, please.
Right now, if your question is what do we do if council passes a 50% cut this year with no plan? If that means zeroing out the budget and there's no police, I will veto it. If it means having impacts on the department that the chief decides that we can't have adequate community safety, I will veto it. We want to work with council for a responsible process to do this, but using a blunt cut without thinking about the consequences is not responsible.
Thank you, Mayor. Our next question is from David Cronin, Prospect, followed by Martha Belisle, Associated Press. David, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. This is for the mayor. Can you say more about moving OPA out of the Seattle Police Department? My understanding, most of the investigators are sworn officers. Will they still be sworn officers, or will that office become more civilian?
So it shows you exactly, David, why you can't do it with just a stroke of a pen and why we're proposing it for next year. Every one of these changes has technical and labor issues and budget issues and policing issues attached to it. OPA, as you know, is an independent agency, but it's included in the Seattle Police Department budget. We will make it a standalone independent agency, and we will discuss with the director how and when they need to further civilianize. It has been, up to this point, people's belief that you needed some sworn officers who have done the job in order to do the investigations to know whether the job was done correctly. But that'll be a conversation we have to have with OPA, with the CPC, with the OIG, and also with the federal court, because the function of OPA is controlled by the consent decree, and the court has made it very clear that the city of Seattle cannot act unilaterally to change anything that relates to that consent decree.
Thank you, Mayor. Our next question will be from Martha Belisle, Associated Press, followed by Ryan Harris, Como Radio. Martha, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Good morning. Mayor Durkan, where will the $4.5 million for the OPA come from? And second question, have you been in discussions with the Community Police Commission for all of these changes, and what are their suggestions?
Two different questions, but both of them really good. That is OPA's current budget. It will no longer be in the Seattle Police Department budget. So that is already allocated this year. In addition to that, I have met repeatedly or multiple times with the Office of Police Accountability, the Office of Inspector General, and the Community Police Commission to ensure them that we wanted them to have the resources they need to do the oversight of the Seattle Police Department. So we will, of course, be discussing with them whether they need additional resources moving forward. We have met with the CPC before. We will continue to have discussions. We know that the CPC is having internal deliberations themselves, meeting with community and having community engagement. And we look forward to getting their suggestions. But it tells you again, our council, 7 out of 9 members, decided they would just cut 50% because that's what people put on a placard without talking to the Community Police Commission and waiting for their suggestions, without talking to the chief of police, without looking at the budget in a way where they could make serious adjustments to say, you know what, we think this function can be done by someone else, or we don't need it at all. Instead of just announcing the cuts, I think the responsible way, again, is to start with the premise we want to have adequate service to respond to the emergencies in every part of this city 24/7. And if that's with a police officer, we need a certain number of sworn officers. If it's with some other alternative, like a medic or a firefighter, we need enough of those. And if it's with a social worker or an intervention specialist or an addiction specialist, we need to have those people ready and trained 24/7 too. And that last category doesn't exist today.
Thank you, Mayor. Our next question will come from Ryan Harris, Como Radio, followed by Kate Walters, KUOW. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, Mayor. You just mentioned issues that can't be dealt with the stroke of a pen, including labor. Doesn't that include the contract with the Police Officers Guild? I mean, it runs out into here, but wouldn't making a huge slash in just this year's budget have an effect on that and possibly cause some problems with the union?
One of the things we have to look at are the labor impacts of any of the cuts, the civilianization, or the moving. For example, parking enforcement officers are subject to their own collective bargaining agreement, and it may have labor impacts when we move them out of the Seattle Police Department. So each one of those factors has a whole range of complications, not just labor contracts, but how does it interact with other agencies in the city? Can it be done by somebody else, or does it undermine their work? Perfect example, we saw in the last weeks that there are a number of things that the city does where people that are not police respond to an emergency. Sometimes that is somebody who's going because there is a mental health or a crisis intervention that's needed. Sometimes it's a fire. But if there are security and safety issues, those people won't go to that scene unless the Seattle Police Department is there. And so there's a whole range of calls that may need both kinds of responses. But City Council has done nothing, has made no attempt to assess what that is, what the workforces will look like, and how they actually will respond to emergencies. They're simply told the people of Seattle, we're going to cut police by 50%, and we don't know what impact that's going to have on your community, but we hope it's okay.
Thank you, Mayor. And our next and final question will come from Kate Walters, KUOW. Kate, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, great. Mayor Durkan, you mentioned $20 million in cuts because of reduction in hiring or proposed hiring for 2021. Is there going to be any actual cuts to current personnel in your plan? And then a second question for you. Can you talk a little bit about what it looks like to move 911 dispatchers out of SPD, and will that be effective January 1st of 2021, or what's the timeline for that?
So on the first, on the terms of the hiring freeze, the number one requirement that Chief Best and I have is that we have an adequate number of very trained police officers and crisis intervention specialists and the other people who are employees of the Seattle Police Department, that we have the right workforce to respond to what the city needs 24/7 in every part of the city. And so we will be doing a workforce analysis to see what that response looks like and what kind of personnel that we need. That's going to be the number that we budget for. And so I will not be setting any arbitrary numbers, but we do believe, based on historic attrition and the like, that there is a base number that the chief believes that she can provide those services, but that assessment's not done. But the amount that's in the budget is the amount that we think can be saved even once that assessment is made. The second part of your question was, I forgot, Kate, sorry.
One moment, I'll get her back on.
Oh, I know what it was. 911. We're looking right now at, it cannot happen this year, moving the 911 call center. And one of the things we want to assess, hopefully in partnership with the City Council, is where should the 911 call center management live? I think a logical place might be with our Emergency Operations Center, which now also will be outside the police budget. But those kind of discussions are the collaborative approach that we need to have to be looking at just not the labor implications, but really the management of a department and who it's connected to. So we're hoping to have those discussions, and it will be part of the proposal for next year's budget.
Mayor, with your permission, I'd like to squeeze one more question.
Sure.
From Daniel Beekman from the Seattle Times. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. And I suppose this is a question for the mayor. Just wondering about those planned cuts you laid out for the 2021 budget. Is it right to understand that with the call center and emergency management and the OPA, those would there be cost savings associated with those that would be redirected to, community-based interventions, or are those more just moving the functions and the budgets that already exist outside the Seattle Police Department?
So that's a really good question, Dan. We're doing two things here. We're restructuring the department itself to reflect that what we have heard from community in various ways is that there are many jobs that should not be a law enforcement job. There are jobs that are much more tied to a broader community safety. And so some of these realignments are just that. We are moving it out of a law enforcement posture. And for example, in the 911 call center, the majority of those employees are already civilian. And the ability to move that management of that to another area makes sense. Now, there may be additional budget savings that we can make, but right now we are assuming that those moves are budget neutral, so they will not result in savings to be reinvested into the community. And I want to point out, Dan, that I think that's a really important distinction you're making, and one the chief and I are trying to be very transparent about. That we will restructure the department, but that restructuring does not always end up in more resources for the community. I'd urge council to be that transparent, because just last week they proposed a range of changes that they said would be cutting the budget by 50%. But those cuts would not result in a reduction of the overall city budget, nor would they result in investment into communities. It's one reason why, regardless of where we end up on how we reimagine policing, I have committed to $100 million of new investments in community. I have made that commitment that we will do that because I think we have to do both things. We have to invest in community at a scale we haven't done before. In the last 2 years, we have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in communities, particularly our communities of color and our black communities, through childcare and housing and free tuition and grants to the Seattle Public Schools, to community-based organizations. But we have to do more. And I'm prepared to do more at the same time that I know we have to restructure and reimagine how community safety looks, not just our city, but across this country. Thank you very much. Any follow-up, Chief, that you'd like to make? Thank you much for your time. All right, thank you very much.
Holding that cough the entire time.